This is the Amazon rainforest. As large as the continental United States, it is the most biodiverse region of the entire planet. But the Amazon isn't just a rainforest, it's a battleground. Why does saving the Amazon seem impossible? Can a forest that has withstood empires survive humanity's relentless march forward? This is not another video about how the Amazon is doomed, because the truth is that it's complicated. It's a story of power, poverty, and survival in the heart of the world's greatest jungle. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. In the previous videos, we've looked at what we know about the Amazon before the Europeans arrived and what happened when they did. We told the story of the rubber boom when the Amazon was the center of the world for one of the industrial world's most precious commodities. But by the middle of last century, the forest had defeated them all: the conquistadors, the colonists, and Henry Ford. The region had reverted to a sleepy backwater, and its towns and cities were in decline. Oh, how different it is today. The Amazon rainforest matters for Brazil and for the world. In 1937, Brazilian President Getúlio Vargas had a plan. Drawing on the ideas of Mussolini's Italy and Salazar's Portugal, he announced the Estado Novo, or New State. Henceforth, his regime would readjust the political organism to the economic needs of the country. In 1940, Vargas gave a speech that is considered the start of the long project to make something of the Amazon. The speech came to be known as the March to the West. It was the task of civilized man to conquer and dominate the forces of nature and transform its fertility into disciplined energy. The Amazon, he said, shall become a chapter in the history of civilization. From Vargas onwards, Brazilian governments would create agencies and schemes to tame the jungle, and they would be helped by three fundamental inventions: the aeroplane, the chainsaw, and the bulldozer. Instead of riding on mules through the mountains or long journeys past rapids on the rivers, the airplane gave the countries of the Andes easy access to the Amazonian cities for the first time. And in Brazil, hopping from airstrip to airstrip, pilots could cross the continent in a day. Each of the Amazonian countries began to connect their rainforests to their centers. Iquitos in Peru, Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia, and Leticia in Colombia only now began to be integrated into their national economies. In Brazil, Belém, Cuiabá, Manaus, and Rio Branco were now linked to the population centers of the coast for the first time. But just as profoundly affected were the tiny towns and missions that dotted the vast interior. Then came chainsaws. While metal blades were a revolution for the indigenous people, it still took hours to fell a big tree. Now that could be done in minutes. Finally came the bulldozers that built the roads. Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia all drove roads over their mountains and deep into their parts of the Amazon. Between 1958 and 1960, Brazil carved out the Road of the Jaguar between Brasilia and Belém. In its first decade, the road helped the region's population grow 20 times over to 2 million. From nothing, they now grazed some 5 million head of cattle, made possible now that they could bring the meat to market. Then BR-364 along the southeastern edge of the rainforest to Porto Velho and Rio Branco became the artery for the greatest migration into virgin territory in South American history. Land wars broke out between colonists and indigenous groups, large landowners and peasants, speculators and squatters. Loggers, ranchers, and wildcat miners all chanced their hand. It was, quite literally, Brazil's Wild West. Grids of roads sliced into the forest on each side of the highway. BR-364 became known as the Great Destroyer of Forests. Throughout this story of the exploitation of the Amazon, it's very easy to see it in simple terms, of rapacious man and his quest to get rich. And there is undoubtedly an element of that, but we have to remember Brazil was a poor place. A very poor place. In 1970, almost half of Brazilians were below the poverty line. In rural areas, 73% were. A quarter of Brazilians were below the destitution line, as defined by having income less than what was needed to buy a standard basket of food, as defined by economists. In rural areas, that was 42%. In other words, in 1970s rural Brazil, more than 2/5 couldn't afford enough to eat. A 1975 study conducted by the Brazilian government and the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization found that the diets of over 1/3 of Brazilians didn't reach World Health Organization calorie requirements, and 58% of Brazil's children were underweight. So, poverty was real and widespread, and how to improve the livelihoods of rural Brazilians in particular was an urgent problem. That is the context in which this takes place, at least its early stages. In 1971, the military president of Brazil, Emílio Médici, responding to another severe drought in the northeast, promised to open the Amazon to these poor people. This was the period in Brazil's history known as the Bleeding Years. Enemies of the government were imprisoned and tortured. For the generals, the opening of the Amazon would solve two problems. It would be a land without people for a people without land. Brazil would finally fill the Amazon with Brazilians. The drought pushed a reverse migration of families into Brazil's interior, following a promise of owning land, cheap loans, and free seeds. This was the Brazilian dream, of a sort. I also want to say that to imagine this as the continued exploitation of a continent by white men is just too simple. Many of these people were black or mixed-race Brazilians, themselves products of the centuries of mixing, some of it forced, between European colonists, imported Africans, and indigenous Americans. Most of these settlers were not privileged, and few of them were white. They were pushed into the Amazon as much by suffering as by greed. With that, Medici launched the Trans-Amazonica Highway. Unlike previous roads, this one didn't go anywhere. It was a penetration road, and the purpose was to pierce the forest. By 1974, the 2,232-kilometer stretch from the Tocantins to the Madeira was done. If it were placed on a map of Europe, it would reach from Lisbon to Moscow. More roads joined the Trans-Amazonica, from Cuiabá to Santarém, from Porto Velho to Manaus, and from Manaus to Roraima. The military government had a plan, a vision of endless fields of cattle, ranches subsidized by the government, and the triumph would be broadcast around the country. In the early days, all the Amazonian countries offered subsidies for improving the land. In 1957, Manaus was declared a free economic zone. The idea was to industrialize the Amazon, and it worked. Soon businesses were relocating there for the tax breaks, and rich Brazilians flew there to buy things free of Brazil's punishingly high tariffs. Manaus, in the middle of the rainforest, became Brazil's center for domestic appliances. In other words, since the 70s, Brazilians have paid higher prices for their motorbikes, televisions, and fridges in order to create jobs in the rainforest. Greater Manaus now has a population of almost 3 million people. Container ships sail up the Amazon to its deepwater port, direct from the United States, Europe, and Asia. Honda, Yamaha, Sony, Nokia, Philips, Kodak, and Samsung all manufacture their products in Manaus. When Latin American consumers buy TVs or motorcycles, there's a decent chance it was assembled in the middle of the world's largest tropical forest. And what does this metropolis, a city in the jungle that shouldn't really be there, look like today? Who lives there, and how do they live? That is what we are going to explore now. This is Manaus. Much of what you are seeing is a result of growth in just the last half century. Modern Manaus is a scruffy combination of the antique and the modern, from the theatre to the cobblestones and old buildings of the centre, decaying in the humid tropics. The first place I was staying with my friends Leticia and Dan had a view of the Teatro Amazonas, the theatre that was built at the height of the Amazonian rubber boom. On our first morning we went out to explore and had a tapioca, made using starch from cassava, native to the Amazon, which are popular across Brazil. You can have it with ham, cheese, and, in this case, tucumã, another Amazonian fruit. Obrigado. Tapioca com tucumã. Near the port is the municipal market, where we stopped for lunch and to sample as many juices made from as many Amazonian fruits as we could find. You can also get products with rainforest remedies for a wide range of ailments. And of course, cachaça, Brazil's national alcohol, made from different jungle products. While the cashew nut is spread across the world, it's only in Brazil that I've seen the cashew fruit from which the nut comes. On the outskirts of Manaus is Musa, a forested area where you can see all the creepy crawlies of the rainforest. Just outside Musa is Cidade de Deus, or City of God, a neighborhood with origins as recent as 1993, when landless migrants moved in and started building houses. To talk of the Amazon today is to talk above all about two Brazilian states, Amazonas and Pará. Combined, these two massive states contribute less than 4% of Brazil's GDP and are extremely poor places. Pará has a GDP per capita of less than $5,000, Amazonas less than $7,000. This map shows the ethnic composition of Brazil. As you can see, the vast majority of the inhabitants of the rainforest are mixed race, with Amazonas and Pará having the highest proportions in the country, at almost 70%, and relatively few white or black Brazilians, but pockets of high numbers of indigenous Brazilians. This map is a product of the centuries of mixing in the Amazon between indigenous and Europeans, with a small amount of African heritage, and then the massive immigration into the region over the 20th century. Over half of the people in Amazonas live in Manaus, and of them, half live in slums, without title to their homes. Violence is endemic. As of 2021, Amazonas had the country's third highest homicide rate. Amapá, the state near the mouth of the river, the highest, Roraima in the north, the fifth, and Pará the 8th. If it were a country, Amazonas would have the 4th highest murder rate in the world. Amapá would be number 1. When I first moved to Brazil, one of the first shows I watched was called Killer Ratings, or Bandidos na TV, about a man named Wallace Souza, a former police officer who was host of Canal Livre, a local program that showed police raids and arrests and was one of the most popular shows in the region. Canal Livre was always the first to get to the crime scene. Off the back of the show, he was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Amazonas before being arrested and charged with hiring hitmen to kill people to increase ratings of the show. He died in prison. It was a hell of a watch, but paints a dark picture of the world's biggest rainforest. And here we have to talk about the role of organized crime in the Amazon. The Familia do Norte, or FDN, control the key cocaine smuggling route between Tabatinga and Manaus, moving the coke from the drug fields in Peru and Colombia in small planes hopping between jungle airstrips, then sending it on to Brazil's capital cities or the markets of Europe and North America. Their biggest rival is the Primeiro Comando de Capital, or PCC, which is based in Sao Paulo and is Latin America's biggest gang and one of the world's largest. The PCC controls around half of Brazil's cocaine exports and is even expanding in West Africa, where a lot of the cocaine is moved through. According to Brazil's federal police, in Nigeria, PCC gangsters control entire neighborhoods of Lagos and Abuja, just like they do in Sao Paulo. And the Amazon is one of its key battlegrounds. Drug gangs have diversified into illegal timber and gold, and endangered animals as well. In 2017, in fighting between the PCC and FDN in a Manaus prison, 56 prisoners were killed, many decapitated with their heads thrown over the perimeter fence. Severed limbs were stacked by the entrance. And of course, the drug gangs are entwined with government, in some cases with politicians trading favors with the criminal groups in exchange for guaranteed votes. It isn't pretty, and adds another obstacle to the path that the Amazon must walk if it is going to realize the hopes of the people that live there. After Musa, we head back into town. As well as a view of the theatre and the river, our accommodation also looks down into what is, I assume, a favela. The reality of Manaus' insecurity, if we could ever forget it, was brought home to me when we saw the police enter, looking for someone, guns drawn. Brazil, as they say, is not for beginners. But all of this is not to say that Manaus can't be a really pleasant place. In another neighbourhood where we stayed, we found a park in which, though somewhat littered in trash, people were indulging in two of Brazilians' great passions: their pets and their sports. Out at Ponta Negra, not too far from the centre of Manaus, the dark water slips by and Manaus' residents unwind. It was a Sunday night and still bustling, late into the evening. On any Brazilian beach, you can get the usual popcorn and fried plantain, but also, most famously, grilled cheese. One evening we take in a bit of culture. a ballet of Don Quixote at the theatre. After some high culture, on another evening we mix it with the people, having heard about a gig of sertanejo, Brazilian country music. Before the band is on, however, with an old football game on the screen, the DJ plays funk, and the people dance, just like at the ballet. Then the sertanejo starts. Manaus, like most in Brazil, is a city of contrasts, with a hard edge that never goes away and can make it a little difficult to truly relax. The Amazon has always been the wild frontier of Brazil, and indeed of all the countries that share it, a region of both lawlessness and opportunity. In 1979, a farmer found a gold nugget in the mud of Serra Pelada in the Brazilian state of Pará. It started a gold rush that attracted tens of thousands of wildcat prospectors. Dozens of unsolved murders occurred around the town every month, and thousands of women and girls were drawn in their desperation to the mine to prostitute themselves in exchange for gold. It became symbolic of the lawlessness and depravity of the exploitation of the Amazon, and created some of the most epic and terrifying images of human endeavor you are likely to see anywhere. An example of the messy compromises of economic development in the Amazon are the dams. The military government, back in the 70s, planned to flood an incredible 2% of the entire rainforest for reservoirs. But again, the picture is complicated. While some of these mega projects were disasters, they were made for a reason. Itaipu, built by the military government in Brazil's south in the 1970s, destroyed a beautiful set of waterfalls, flooded 1,350 square kilometers, and displaced 10,000 families, but now supplies 17% of Brazil's electricity. practically without carbon emissions, as well as 73% of Paraguay's. Hydropower alone gives Brazil around 65% of its electricity. In fact, Brazil has one of the highest proportions of renewable energy in electricity production of any large country in the world, at around 80%, compared to a global average of 29%. The only other large country that comes close is Canada with 65%. Germany, with only 40% the population of Brazil but a similar level of demand, only gets around half as much of their power from renewables. The United States, just 14%. The alternatives, both at the time and for the immediate future, as far as I can see, are to either burn more fossil fuels or starve Brazilians of electricity, and Brazilians still use a whole lot less electricity per person than any rich country. For comparison, South Korea, with less than a quarter of as many people, consumes roughly the same amount of electricity, of which only 2.8% comes from renewable sources. Remember, the alternative to this is the blackouts that crippled Brazil's cities in the early 2000s when officials refused to give advance warning of power cuts for the very real fear of violence and looting during the outages. As Lula said in 2009, "I don't want any gringo asking us to let an Amazon resident die of hunger under a tree." And he had a point. But the main problem, as everyone knows, is deforestation. Between 1960 and the year 2000, the population of the Amazon went from 2 million to 20 million, almost all living in the arc of deforestation. A World Bank report in 1988 calculated that 12% of the entire forest cover of Brazil had been cleared in just the previous decade, though the Brazilian government disputed this. The thing is, as farmland, the rainforest just isn't very good. Many developing country leaders make the point that northern countries have already created incredible farming economies by clearing their forest and have no right to tell tropical countries not to do the same. And that does make a certain amount of sense. But the analogy isn't a good one. Rainforest soils are already impoverished because most of the nutrients are stored in the biomass, which gets burnt off. And when exposed to the rain, its minerals get washed out and decompose its organic compounds. After a couple of crops, the already poor soil is exhausted, or the topsoil washes away in the rain and the farmers have to move on and clear more land. Chopping down rainforest gives you surprisingly little. A freshly cleared hectare of the Amazon is only worth around $1,200, for which 500 tons of CO2 are released into the atmosphere. It wasn't until 2003, when Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, became president, that Brazil's government, under pressure from both domestic and international opinion, really began to actually do something about deforestation. Under Lula, the area in which farming was prohibited increased from a sixth to almost half of the forest. The environmental police were given resources and land protections were strengthened. NGOs started publishing monthly data on where deforestation was happening. As Brazil had become more prosperous, they had developed a constituency that cared about the rainforest. In 2008, the government started publishing a list of municipalities with the worst records. Businesses and places on the list were not eligible for cheap credit from state-owned banks. International campaigns to boycott products like soya and beef started to hit farmers in their wallets. It also helps that Brazil's birth rate has dropped from 5 children per woman in 1970 to only 1.6 today. With Brazil's continuing urbanization, there are simply fewer poor, landless Brazilians. Between 2004 and 2012, deforestation across the Amazon fell by 80%, from 28,000 square kilometers a year to less than 5,000. According to an Economist article in 2013, burning down the rainforest had become socially unacceptable. It was a successful story of government direction and determination, incentives, especially market ones, for local authorities, an energetic NGO sector to gather and share information, and an independent media to report it, plus a functioning police force. Most importantly though, you need a public that cares. By 2014, 44% of the Brazilian Amazon was national park, wildlife reserve, or indigenous reserve, where farming was banned. And The Economist was writing, "By any standards, Brazil's Amazon policy has been a triumph." Over this period, Brazil also turned itself into a farming superpower, so the country has shown it is possible to get a huge increase in food output without destroying the forest, though there was some deforestation at first. Brazil, you were doing so well. However, If you've been following the news over the past few years, you will have seen that this good run didn't last. From around 2012, deforestation started to accelerate again. Economic recession and political crisis reduced the government's ability to enforce the rules. In 2018, deforestation had ticked up to 7,900 square kilometers a year, mainly by loggers. And then came Jair Bolsonaro, one of the world's people. To get a measure of the man, aside from routinely praising Brazil's military dictatorship, he said in 1999, "I am in favor of torture, you know that." In 2011, I would be incapable of loving a homosexual son, and that he would prefer he died in an accident than showed up with some bloke with a moustache. In 2014, he told an opposition congressman, "I wouldn't rape you because you don't deserve it," which he followed up in a newspaper interview by saying she was not worth raping, she is very ugly. In 2017, he said of the descendants of black slaves, "They do nothing, they are not even good for procreation." And in 2018, 55% of the Brazilian electorate voted for him in the presidential runoff. In the campaign, he promised to end fines for violating environmental laws, shrink indigenous reserves, and fight green NGOs. He ran on a pledge to not designate 1 more centimetre of indigenous land and told his foreign critics, "The Amazon is Brazil's, not yours." Taking office at the start of 2019, deforestation soared to a rate of an area the size of 2 Manhattans every week. He fired the head of Brazil's Institute for Space Research for releasing satellite images that showed the increase, saying it had brought Brazil's reputation into disrepute. In 2019, there was an 84% rise in the number of fires in the Amazon, and cities as far away as Sao Paulo were covered in smog caused by Amazonian fires 2,700 kilometers away. So Bolsonaro accused environmental groups of lighting them to make him look bad. When Emmanuel Macron accused him of lying, Bolsonaro called his wife ugly and rejected an offer from the G7 countries to help fight the fires. He slashed funding for the environmental ministry by 2/3 and sabotaged the Amazon Fund. When Joe Biden proposed punishing Brazil for not protecting the forest, he responded by saying, "Diplomacy alone won't work. Once the saliva runs out, you have to have gunpowder." Bolsonaro himself was the son of a garimpeiro, or wildcat miner, and made no effort to stop them. He turned Brazil into a global pariah. In 2022 alone, he handed out more than 340,000 title deeds to people on irregularly occupied farmland. He ordered the Environmental Ministry to stop destroying equipment seized from illegal loggers and miners, and in 2021 visited a wildcat mine in indigenous territory, which are banned in the Constitution, and told them he would make it legal. He suggested that environmentalists who complain about deforestation are part of a foreign plot to steal the Amazon. Bolsonaro was the perfect representation of the military's long-held view that the Amazon must be settled if Brazil is going to keep a hold of it. And under his watch, deforestation accelerated by 60% because he did almost nothing to stop it. I can understand why Brazilians react when people like Al Gore say, contrary to what Brazilians think, the Amazon is not their property. It belongs to all of us. For one thing, it does reek of hypocrisy. But what happens to the Amazon affects the entire world. The World Bank estimates that the Amazon provides $317 billion a year of value to the world, mainly as a carbon store. Admittedly, that number is pretty theoretical, but it is still many times the amount that could be made from farming, mining, or logging. It matters because the Amazon contains 40% of the world's remaining rainforest. It has a quarter of the planet's biodiversity on land. Fragmenting patches of rainforest means that species are deprived of the range they need to survive. It is incredibly difficult for a rainforest to regenerate once it has been farmed. As Charles Mann writes, tropical forest, despite its fabulous vitality, exists on a knife edge. To date, 18% of the Brazilian Amazon has been cut down. Scientists are afraid that at 25%, it will reach a tipping point where it won't be able to sustain itself. For many Brazilians, though, the Amazon is distant. Though the Amazonian states are 60% of Brazil's area, they only hold 13% of the population. Even though it is the world's biggest beef exporter, 80% of Brazil's beef is still sold to Brazilian consumers, and Brazilians love churrasco. So do I, and I've eaten it right there in the middle of the Amazon. So I too am a hypocrite. Then came the presidential election of 2022, an epic showdown between Bolsonaro and Lula. In the first half of the year alone, 45 Brazilian politicians were murdered. Bolsonaro supporters threw feces and urine at the opposition, on one occasion from a drone. It was a close-run thing, but on the 30th of October 2022, Lula was declared president of Brazil once again. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Some of his first decrees on taking office at the start of 2023 were to restore environmental bodies gutted by Bolsonaro, reverse a plan to legalize wildcat gold mining, and reactivate the Amazon Fund. But the budget for the environmental ministry, both thanks to Bolsonaro but also thanks to inflation, is only a quarter of what it was in 2010. Lula is determined to save the Amazon, and his crackdown has been real. In February of 2023, Lula launched an operation to remove 20,000 illegal miners from Yanomami lands, Brazil's largest indigenous territory. The Brazilian government has also been seizing the barges of wildcat miners and blowing them up. However, the obstacles that remain are massive. Tax distortions still encourage farmers to cultivate more land than they otherwise would, and a disproportionate amount of Brazil's farm subsidies go to cattle ranchers in the Amazon, raising the value of farmland and encouraging people to make more of it by cutting down trees. While around 42% of the Brazilian Amazon is either protected or indigenous reserve, there is another 29% that is neither, an area almost twice the size of Texas. It is a mess. Lula has a plan to regularize all this, but it's a gigantic job. There are at least 22 government agencies that can register land claims, and they don't talk to each other. As a result, land grabbing is rife, and on the frontier, it's money or violence that talks. Since 1986, more than 1,000 activists have been killed. No more than a handful of people have ever been brought to trial. Lawlessness in the Amazon, indeed in all of Brazil, is not a problem that any Brazilian president can solve overnight. Brazil actually has plenty of sensible federal rules, as do all the Amazonian countries. The problem is enforcement. The Amazon is twice the size of India and spreads across 9 countries. Illegal loggers are able to launder their timber, often in league with local officials, and much of what they do is in the most remote forests. The problem is that many areas rely on mining, ranching, or farming, and local officials there are willing to overlook environmental crimes. Even though most artisanal mining in the Amazon is illegal, the garimpeiros still get permits. Private landowners are required to conserve 80% of the forest on their land, but that is regularly flouted. Meat raised on recently deforested land can't be sold, but this system is easy to cheat, and most Brazilian beef is sold inside Brazil and not to the multinational chains that are responsive to consumer boycotts. The fact is that in most of the Amazon, loggers and farmers can destroy forest with impunity. It's a lot for Lula to sort out, and he has to do so quickly. The problem is that his space to operate is severely limited. Lula is not a king. Brazil is a federal country, and many of the Amazonian states are, at best, reluctant. Lula is far less popular than during his first term, and has far less influence over Congress, where he leads a fractious coalition. The agribusiness lobby has links to well over half of the legislators in Congress, up from a fifth in 2010. International incentives are also limited. Though in 2023 the 8 South American countries that share the Amazon basin created an alliance to cooperate on stopping deforestation, it lacks firm commitments, and the other countries, though invited, didn't sign up to Brazil's zero deforestation goal by 2030. Only 5% of Brazil's agricultural exports go to consumers. The rest are commodities, like soy, mostly to Asia, where concerns about conservation are a whole lot less widespread. Chinese companies, for example, haven't signed up to promises to stop buying soybeans from newly deforested land. Now more than 25 million hectares of land, a lot of which was once Amazon rainforest, are used to cultivate soy. Soy can be found in about 60% of all processed foods, but its main use is to feed poultry and livestock. One expert thinks that more than half the world's feed crops are soon going to be used in China's pork industry. As The Economist put it, entire species of plants and trees are being sacrificed to fatten China's pigs. Brazil is now the world's 4th biggest food exporter, and its farmers feed over 800 million people. It's not an easy ship to turn around. As well as that, on Brazil's rainforest frontier, for many poor Brazilians, stopping deforestation also means destroying jobs. The Amazonian states are still among Brazil's poorest, and in the Amazon, opportunities are scarce. 2/3 of 10-year-olds in the Amazon can't read a simple sentence. Most minors can barely read or write. Are these people, many of whom don't have much of an education, just going to be told to move to the cities? And do what? Poverty is widespread, and these people's suffering is real. Lula can't just take away, he also has to give, so has promised to pave as many roads as possible to help local economies, which makes environmentalists scream, because historically paved roads have been the single largest driver of deforestation. But the people that live in these areas want the goods and services that connection to the worldwide market provides. If you're watching this video, that's probably what you have. Lula, for very good reasons, wants to boost the economy, and there's probably no way to avoid ugly compromises here. If Lula pushes too hard, he could provoke a backlash and lose the next election, then we would be back where we started. Remember, Lula only beat Bolsonaro by 50.9% to 49.1%. When Lula outlined his ambitious plan to stop deforestation, he said, "There should be no contradiction between economic growth and environmental protection." We just have to hope he's right. At the time of recording this video, Brazil has lost almost a fifth of its rainforest, more than the area of France or Texas, and around the same size as Turkey. Though it has slowed, it's not yet enough. So the roads keep getting built. One of the possibilities was to extend the Trans-Amazonica from western Acre to Pucallpa in Peru, a distance of only 250 kilometers. From there, it's just a day by truck to Lima. Brazil's farmers in Mato Grosso could ship their produce to markets across the Pacific. The problem is about who lives there. In 2008, footage was released of a flyover that captivated the world. There, in a rainforest being transformed by technology and globalization, was a group of people that were still living as they always had. People who know nothing about soy or cattle, earth movers, and internet. It is to them, the uncontacted people of the Amazon, that we will turn to in the next video.